sense. The third state is what I call the embrace. And there you're really embracing the both and, because you're about to say everything you give to me in this energy, I am going to embrace, even the most difficult things. So your consciousness is now moving into what we call non-duality. See, the end of that quote that I gave you when it said, Mahmoud Abdal simply says, your heart must face its tests. The end of the quote is, until some sweets turn bitter in the end, this heart won't answer yes. See, the deepest heart is bittersweet. It's non-dual. It takes every experience with equal gratitude, with equal intensity, with equal honoring, not saying, I'll live for everything but that. Don't do that. Don't make it go this way. And so I also talk in the book about the very high state of not forcing anything. And when you get into that state where you're embracing everything, which takes deep practice, let's face it, it is the non-dual state, it's the bittersweet. It's the joy that knows the sorrow. It's the joy that looks deep into the heart of the world and says there is genocide, there is persecution, there is birth, there is death. There are all of these mixed beauties and uglinesses all in one offering. And I am not the judge. I'm not the determiner of what happens on this planet. So I see it as it is, but deep compassion, I believe, has this dimension. I see it as it is, so I cannot deny the truth of racism, of hatred, of violence, and all the beauties and all the splendid celebrations on the planet. All those together, mixed together. That's the way it is. But it doesn't need to be that way. In other words, the Dalai Lama once said, it is not enough to be compassionate. One must act. So the compassionate is an essential part of it. It says, this is the way it is, and my heart has been broken wide open to embrace it in a non-judgmental, non-dual way. And now I must act. I must say, this is my contribution to ending the suffering and the pain of what is now. So otherwise, if it were not so, we would be very smug and self-satisfied and say, well, that's the way it is.
Right.
Get on with it.
In the book, it feels like the frame is getting closer and closer. You move from an initial direct encounter to a handshake and then to an embrace. It's getting more and more intense with the teacher. Now, what about this dimension that all of this comes and goes, including this particular teacher?
Yes, I think when you learn to embrace everything, there is a transformation that occurs. So there's a very intense place before that where you've done so many good things in your life, and there's one last element which we call the shadow. So yes, there is the shadow, and I refer to it in the book as the encounter between shadow and grace. Because let us say with anger, as we talked about it, you've done your best now in your consciousness to witness the anger, but somewhere inside of you, you've made anger wrong. There's that little part of your consciousness that says, anger is bad. Good spiritual people don't get angry, right? That's the shadow, and it's like a stain. It's the final thing that needs to be dissolved, because what your question was asking is really, is there then something that really deeply dissolves? And so what I say at that moment, I really believe it is true. That when the human goes this deep and this far, grace comes in. There is no way we can complete the story ourselves from our own effort. And so I have this image that, you know, one day you meet the shadow and you see the anger and you've said deep in your heart, I can deal with anything but that. And then it's that shows up. And because you've been sincere, because you've really worked at it, grace enters the story. And it's like a thunderstorm and lightning and fireworks, and it's very dramatic because the anger pours all over you. That's the issue, right? You experience the depth of anger, and the anger washes you. You're washed by it, and you say, what a mystery. And that's what we call also psychologically deep integration. Mm-hmm. So yes, you're right, that at some point you get a dissolution, a dissolving of things. You actually, the very thing you rejected at one point becomes the thing that comes at you, and you see maybe at some point in your life you weren't ready for it. It was the energy that burnt you, or you touched it because you were too young, or you weren't available, or it wasn't right, and you got burnt and you got very stressed by it, but you learned how to work with it. And in some ways you made it a little bit bad, and then it comes and it reveals its essence, which is the final, it's like the final initiation of the teacher. It pours through you, and have you ever experienced that, where you've been cleansed by the anger? Somebody was angry with you, and instead of it hurting you, you felt it just wash through you. That means really you're ready to dissolve your negative relationship.
We want to hear your personal story on that.
Well, I have one final personal story to share, which was around not anger but despair. I was in Beirut during the war, and then there were the massacres at the Shabra Shatila camps, and they found children murdered under their beds. Deeply, deeply desolate level of the male fighters had gone, and they came in and they massacred and butchered the women and the children. And I was in Beirut when it happened. In the morning that we discovered what had happened, I felt despair. I felt these human beings are so capable of the most terrible acts of savagery and brutality. So it was really very close to that point when you reach the bottom, and you say, you know, I'm willing to it's again your conditional relationship. I'm willing to serve humanity, but not if humanity goes to this place. Then I reject humanity. I despair of humanity. And that's when grace again entered the picture. And a few days later, in the rubble of the Palestinian camp, another Palestinian camp, there was an old man. Everything was bombed and desolate. And he was calling like this, come over. And when I got to him, he said, you must have coffee with me. And I looked at the rubble. So it was like an image of desolation and destruction. And his family had been killed in the bombs. But he pulled out this old little gas stove and began to make and pour the coffee in this traditional manner where it boils up and then you let it. And he was doing it with the flick of his wrist. And I saw right there, through grace, I saw in him the indestructible spirit of the human being. The spirit was speaking to me. And what the spirit was saying was, I am spirit. I am not destructible. No bombs can blow away the spirit. Nothing can reduce me to being subhuman. And so right at the point where it was lowest, and I tried my best, Grace entered and said, look, witness the spiritual being in the heart of the human. That's what you must move towards and celebrate, the deepening of the spiritual being in humanity.